Our first plenary session for the New Clinicians Conference is entitled Foundations of Clinical Teaching and Overview of Best Practices. Some quick housekeeping announcements about the session. It's going to be recorded. We've already been recording. You should feel free to leave your video off if that makes you more comfortable. Please make sure that you keep yourself muted just throughout so that we can make sure we preserve the integrity of the recording. A reminder that our small groups are going to be meeting after this session, beginning at 12:45 Eastern Time. And please note that the small groups required advanced registration. We're unfortunately not able to accommodate anybody who didn't pre-register for the small groups just because of all the work that went into preparing them. We hope you will understand. The small groups are going to be a chance for you who did register to meet each day with the same people in an informal setting, to debrief, to have open conversation that will focus on digging into the larger group topics in a little bit more depth. And we ask, if you are signed up, that you make every effort to be at every session. They are incredibly valuable. You will network, you will dive in, as I said, more deeply, and we know you will enjoy yourselves. If you don't have your small group assignment, please email Lisa. We'll make sure her email is in the chat once more, but the small groups will start at 12:45 Eastern. If you want to ask a question for this session coming up, we ask that you write the question in the chat. We will do our best to be both monitoring the chat for questions and to try to address those questions either in the flow of the session or if there is time for Q&A afterwards. But if we don't get to them, no, it is not personal. We're trying to get through everything we have planned for. So it is with great pleasure that I will briefly introduce our three plenary presenters this morning, each of whom will tell you a little bit more about themselves shortly. First is Professor Alicia Alvarez, who is a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Experiential Education at the University of Illinois Chicago John Marshall School of Law. Katherine Banks is currently an associate professor of practice at Washington University School of Law, where she directs the Children's Rights Clinic. And in the fall, Professor Banks will be joining the faculty at St. Louis University School of Law. And last but absolutely not least is Professor Kelly Terry, who is the Associate Dean for Experiential Learning and Clinical Programs and the Ben J. Altheimer Professor of Law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law. In addition, and Professor Terry will tell you a little bit more about herself in a moment. We have designed this session. You are going to be hearing from three experts, really three wonderful teachers and clinicians. And the focus of this session, we've designed it so that it will be very intentionally conversational. So we hope you will enjoy observing a conversation between Professor Alvarez, Professor Terry, Professor Banks. And this session is not aspiring to leave you with the end-all be-all definitive understanding of what clinical teaching and pedagogy is, but rather to familiarize you further and to have you considering what best practices may be in the course of your clinical teaching. And we're going to start off with a quick interactive exercise here. Hold on a moment. I'm going to share a poll that we ask that you respond to, share the results just to get to know each other a little bit. It's hard, obviously, we're not together. I know you've done your fair share of polling, but if you will indulge us, I'm going to launch this poll. Can you all see this? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, if you could just take a shot at answering these. Flying, about 20% of you have responded. This is great. All right, give it another 20 seconds or so. Wow. The realization is great, almost 80%. Okay. another 5 seconds or so. I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results here. Can y'all see this? Okay. So it looks like a strong majority of attendees have been teaching law school experiential courses for 1 to 2 years, but we've got a nice sampling, folks who haven't started yet, folks who've been teaching a little longer than that. Where did you come from? About 75% of you have come from public interest or community lawyering practice, but we've got, again, a variety here. Private practice, it's where I came from before I transitioned into clinical teaching. And then lastly, okay, 81% are teaching in-house clinics, sorry. 25% teaching externship courses. All right, some of you coming from teaching non-clinical and simulation courses. Some of you won't be teaching or are not teaching now. My background is in both in-house clinical teaching and externship teaching, and the aim of today's session is really to speak to best practices and sort of guidance points to address all kinds of experiential teaching, right? As a community, so much of what we do overlaps, and it's one of the most wonderful things about us. So I'm gonna, let's see. Okay. So with that, I am going to ask Alicia and Kathryn and Kelly to each answer the questions that were just posed to you. And then we will get started with 4 questions, the first of 4 questions that are going to guide our conversation this morning. So Alicia, can I turn to you first?
Sure. Welcome everyone. It's so great to see all the faces and even the names. So I have been teaching more than 5 years. Let's just say this. I remember when CLIA was formed. I was already a clinical professor, so that gives you a sense of how long I've been teaching. I came from public interest. I'd worked in legal services and another public interest organization before coming to clinical teaching. And I have taught exclusively in in-house clinics at different law schools and different kinds of clinics, but only in-house clinics.
Kathryn.
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone. And I apologize in advance. I kicked my 4-legged coworkers out of the room with me, but the trash truck just appeared. So if you hear them barking, I apologize for that. So I'm Katherine Banks. I'm at WashU, and I have been involved in clinical teaching for about 10 years now. The first 5 years were as a staff attorney, where I supported in-house clinics at WashU, and then I left for a little bit and then came back and have been doing directing the Children's Rights Clinic for about 5 years now. The first time I left, or I'm sorry, the first time I came as a staff attorney, I was coming from the public defender's office. And then the second time I came back, I was coming from a nonprofit. And so really enjoy the opportunity to both practice, but also work closely hand in hand with students.
Thank you, Kathryn. Kelly.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kelly Terry, and I'm at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. I did the math before our session today, and so I've been teaching 15 years, which was a little hard for me to believe. I started my career at the Justice Department in DC as a trial lawyer, and then after a few years there, I moved back to Arkansas, which is home for me. Worked a few years at the Attorney General's office, and then was in private practice for a few years. So as I tell my students, I was a bit of a tumbleweed before I settled into teaching. I'm just delighted to be here today to learn from everybody and talk with everyone. And I just want to echo what everyone said before. This is the best job in the world, and the clinic folks are the best people in the world. You should never hesitate to reach out to anyone. If there's ever anything I can do for you or help you with, just email me or call me anytime. But I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
It always amazes me. We all come from different places. My background is a private, big law firm practice, and then an in-house practice at a pharmaceutical company, right? So very different a place of origin for me, and transitioned into a visiting position at the University of North Dakota. I saw Tricia Hodney here. I know North Dakota is represented, and then have been at Memphis for 13 years, teaching both in-house clinics and externships. So again, many of you are going to be teaching across sort of experiential courses. Some of you are going to be more focused, but pedagogy tends to be more similar than not in what we do. Well, thanks to all three of you. Let us get started. We're going to talk about, I'm going to pose 4 broad questions and ask for each of you to weigh in with your responses. And again, just have a conversation. If folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Our first question is, what do you see as the guiding principles that govern how clinicians, right? We're using that term most broadly, clinicians teach and supervise students. What are the guiding principles that govern how clinicians teach and supervise students? Alicia, I'll again turn back to you to start our conversation.
So for me, I think one of those guiding principles is being intentional about what it is we're doing, both in the classroom and seminar and supervision for in-house clinics. And by that, I mean thinking about what you want your course goals to be, what you want those learning outcomes from students to be. And so thinking about both what I do in seminar and what I do in supervision, with the caveat that obviously what happens in supervision has to be also tied to the case or the matters that we're supervising, but thinking about what are the core takeaways that I want the students to be able to take away. What is it I want them to be able to know at the end of the semester? And you'll have a session, we'll have a session on backward designs later, so I don't want to get into too much detail because I think others will do that. And I think, so thinking about learning outcomes, thinking about assessments, how do you assess that the students are getting what it is you're trying to achieve in class? And I think to some extent, I think that this holds true both in in-house clinics and also externships. So it's something that I think we have in common. It isn't one of those times when we can think differently about what it is we're doing. So those would be, for me, sort of being intentional, thinking about what learning outcomes are.
I'm going to come back to you, Alicia, to dig a little bit more, but before we do, I'll turn to Kathryn to answer that question.
I think, to piggyback on what Alicia is saying, an important thing to remember and keep in mind in being intentional is the duality of roles that you have and responsibilities. So you have a responsibility to the students, you have a responsibility to your clients, arguably you have a responsibility to whatever bar it is you're a part of, and a responsibility to the university that you're working with. And so in being intentional, I think you have to think about the importance of all of those relationships in planning out your work and engaging in work with your students and the community. But it's also important to remember, ultimately, you're there to teach, right? And so the students really are your priority. And so sometimes you'll find that there's some tensions in the duality of those different roles. And so being cognizant of that and surfacing that with the students that you work with so that they can recognize and understand some of the challenges that you might face. Maybe there's a really great case that you want to take, but you can't take it because your docket's too full, right? And you would lose time to focus on the student works. And so helping them understand that part of the process, I think is very important.
Thank you, Kathryn. I have some follow-up for you too, just to give you a heads up that it's coming. Kelly.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention earlier that I teach externship courses, and so, or an externship course, and really everything that Kathryn and Alicia just said, applies just as forcefully in the externship context. Specifically, this issue of tension between what sometimes can be competing interests. As Kathryn said, obviously the student's learning is always the primary goal, but in the externship context, for example, we also have the competing interest of the site supervisor, and making sure that they're happy with the work that the student's doing. We want our site supervisors to have good experiences working with our students so that they will continue to participate in our program and provide opportunities, for our students to work there and learn, and sometimes there can be competing interests between what might be the best placement for a student in terms of their learning versus, where they might prefer to work for the resume value. Maybe they want to go in an extern for the U.S. District Court judge, but maybe, they don't have the qualifications that, the district court judge typically expects in an extern. Or, maybe the student would be better suited to go and work for a state appellate court judge if their primary learning goal is to work on writing, where they would have a more research and writing intensive focus. So just sort of managing, all those competing interests, that duality of responsibility. And then I think another guiding principle to keep in mind is the notion that, we as the clinic instructor, another sort of competing interest is sort of ceding control, and when to let students take the lead versus when the instructor kind of has to take the lead on something, and in the externship context, for example, when a problem arises in the placement, how do we as the teacher handle that? Probably it would be easier for us to just pick up the phone and call the site supervisor and try to solve the problem ourselves. But for our students' learning, it's better for us to coax them and teach them how to handle that problem on their own. So, sort of giving up that control, putting them in the lead in that situation, maybe, talking through it with them, and maybe role playing with them how they would broach that topic with the supervisor, but really putting them in the driver's seat in terms of how to handle it.
Thank you, Kelly. Alicia, I want to come back to you within this question and ask something that I've always struggled with, right? We talk about learning goals. Really, learning goals can run the gamut. We can be focusing on so many different points of learning for our students, their development. It could be skills focused. It could be, professional identity focused. It could be, you name it. How have you come to focus your learning goals? And I know we're going to talk in other sessions and dive a little more deeply, but what guidance do you have for new clinicians and maybe not so new clinicians on how to be continually thinking about the focus of the learning goals with clinic and externship students?
That's a really hard question, Danny. I think he's trying to like get me to like fail here. I think, no, I'm kidding. No, but seriously, I think this is a really hard question because in some ways I think about, one of my goals I'm going to answer it eventually, even though if I'm not going to answer it immediately, I think one of my goals for the students is to try to equipment with some of the skills to be what I would call lifelong learners, to think about how you learn from your own experience. And so, and we can talk a little bit about sort of why for me that's important. But I think to some extent, I take that same perspective when it comes to my clinical teaching and my learning goals. I think and the learning goals I set. So that for me, that's been a lifelong process, right? And so going back to what others were saying, that this is the best job. I really, I really think it's a great job, but part of it for me is because it gives me the opportunity to continue to grow as a teacher. And if you were to look at my syllabus, even probably, let's say, if you were to look at my syllabus 10 years ago, my syllabus 20 years ago, from my syllabus this past semester, it would look very different. And I think that, I think where I've grown is, I think I tried to do too much at the beginning. And so I've tried to think about what is it, what are some of the essential things, and what is it that they aren't going to get somewhere else? And then in clinic, what is it that they're going to get, even if I don't focus on it as a learning goal. So for me, one of the really important things is the whole idea of reflection, and it sort of goes back to the point I made about being lifelong learners, because I think that these classes, clinics, and broadly defined, are times when we get to have students focus on what it is they're doing, what their process was for planning, what their performance was like, and helping them evaluate their performance and supporting their evaluation of their performance. So I think it is to sort of giving them the opportunity to sort of build those that skill and ability to evaluate themselves, evaluate others, and to be able to do that, as throughout the life of their professional experience. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I love that answer, actually, because it also reinforces the intentionality that runs it. This is not just a student. We're not just asking our students to be intentional. I think we are modeling intentional approaches. And at least in my case, I'm hearing it with you, putting out there our vulnerability as a team, right? I mean, we are constantly learning as clinicians and in practice, which is something I think the mindset of I'm going to graduate, hit the ground running, yes, and the learning stops and the practice starts. That's an unhealthy approach. So I think reinforcing the intentionality is one of the messages that I hear. Thank you for that. Wonderful answer. Kathryn, with that sort of intentionality in mind, let me follow up on something you said. You talked about the duality of role, which is something really, I think, distinctive in clinical teaching and clinical practice. Is that something over time that you've been very explicit about with your students, talking with them on the front end about that? Or is it something that you think kind of comes with how you teach them, and you don't necessarily talk with them about it as you go? Or is it something in the middle?
I think it is something that I have spent more time lately talking with students about, because I realized that if we are preparing students to go out into the world and practice, they'll also be in situations where they're going to have to make decisions about types of cases to take, interactions with clients, and those sorts of things. And so to the extent that I can help them see some of the thought process that is involved in some of those decisions and that intentionality, I try to do that. I think when you come from a nonprofit or a government position where you just get the cases that you get, and you don't have the opportunity to stop and slow down and decide if this is the right case, or if this is a case that you should take, or can you really help this person achieve the goals that they want, transferring then into teaching, I think, and this is something I'll admit that I struggled with, Do as I say, not as I do, is sort of this, I want to help everyone. I want to take every single case. I'm used to taking everything that's put in front of me, and we can do it and we can go. And you lose the focus on the student that way. And that comes back, I think, to the duality of roles. And so I am intentional in talking with students about that, and taking cases and not taking cases, and reminding them of what our roles and responsibilities are, because I do think it helps. It's just another little area, right, where we can just plant a seed that will hopefully help them once they get out into actual practice.
It's incredible guidance. Kelly, you mentioned in sort of your intentionality with the students, right? You're thinking about the field supervisor in all of this. You have to in teaching externship. It's something that I've come to learn over time. But the supervisor is always acting in a space outside of the law school. How do you engage the supervisor in the pedagogy piece, right? So we're working with our students. We want to be intentional with them. We want to promote all the different sort of learning that we're talking about here. How much do you engage the field supervisor in that sort of intentional effort?
You have to engage the field supervisor a lot. I mean, they play such a substantial role in a student's learning in an externship context. So, I mean, it all starts in the very beginning with just vetting supervisors, who are going to join your program. You really have to look for people who are engaged in the teaching mission with you, who are willing to take on the role of being a mentor to that student. I tell all the supervisors that I work with, you are my co-teacher in this endeavor. You actually see these students more than I do. You are in much closer contact with them in that work setting. So that's kind of the first step. I'm really looking for people who want to embrace that teaching role and, not just have an extra hand at the office to help out with the workload, and then, where the ABA standards require us to do training sessions, for our externship supervisors. But even if they didn't, I think that's a critical component. You have to train the supervisors and help them. They're not trained teachers. They're a lot of times not familiar with clinical pedagogy. So the notion of learning outcomes and assessment and evaluation and, teaching students to be reflective and learn from their experiences. And then just, close communication with the supervisors, throughout the semester. I always encourage them to communicate with me, and not just when, typically you think, oh, they would reach out if they're having a problem with a student, but I tell them, hey, if this student does great work, let me know, because I want to be aware of that. I want to highlight that in my seminar classes, and sort of make other, students aware of that. I want to share the successes with them. And, I check in with the supervisors at mid-semester just to make sure everything's on track. But I have a manual for them, that really explains the goals of the course and what we're trying to accomplish, and how important they are in that process. Really stressing to the supervisors how important they are to the learning.
Question number 2 of our 4, and Kelly, I'm going to come right back to you with this.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the principles and methods that you have found to be effective in getting clinic and externship students to be thinking about professional goals and professional identity specifically?
Right. So I think you're going to hear this word intentionality a lot today. That's sort of the overarching theme, I think, for this whole session. And so when it comes to any subject that you want students to learn, whether it's professional goals or professional identity formation, I think intentionality in your course design is key. It's just a crucial component, and it doesn't stop at articulating the learning outcomes. Once you establish your learning outcomes, then you have to ensure that every other part of your course is consistent with those learning outcomes and supports them. So, your assignments, your assessments that you're going to use, your teaching methods, your reading materials, your case selection, all of that needs to align with those learning outcomes. I tell people, my learning outcomes are my North Star. They're the foundation for everything that I do in my course. So I have 5 learning outcomes in total for my externship course. 2 of those specifically relate to professional identity. If anybody wants the specific language, I'm happy to share those. But what I did after establishing those learning outcomes was then plan my assessments, and I planned my seminar classes, the individual seminar classes, to align with those learning outcomes. We start our seminar with a general discussion of professional identity, as that broad concept. What does that mean? What does that look like for a lawyer? I assign excerpts from the Carnegie Report and articles from Neil Hamilton and Tim Floyd and Kendall Carew, who are really, thought leaders on that subject. And then in subsequent classes, we take that broad concept of professional identity and try to break it down into its component parts, so pro bono work, attorney civility, moral courage. I have a class, that revolves around that concept, different philosophies of lawyering. And then I use a lot of in-class and out-of-class assignments, that build on those classroom discussions. So students have to complete a learning agenda at the beginning of the semester where they have to identify, 5 learning goals for their specific externship experience and work experiences they need to have in order to achieve those goals. And I ask them to describe an action that they can take to measure whether they've met those goals. So, evaluating their own progress, journals, which I think most clinicians use, a quick write exercise in one class where I have them evaluate their response to an ethical dilemma and whether that's consistent with their core values. A simulation exercise in another class where I put them in teams and they have to design a pro bono program for a law firm. And then a final reflective essay, that focuses specifically on professional identity, their understanding of that concept, the qualities they want to incorporate into their own professional identity, actions they're going to take to achieve those qualities, and challenges that they anticipate they're going to face in practice, and steps that they can take to overcome those challenges. So professional identity and professional goals really are the underlying theme for my entire course. And I think externships and clinics are really the ideal place to explore those topics. They can be a unifying theme for students who maybe their casework is different. And I teach a general externship seminar, so I have students at all sorts of different placements. But professional identity is a learning outcome that's common to all of them, regardless of where they're working. And I think it's a crucial component of legal education. I think the Carnegie Report made that clear. And then, it's just an ideal place to explore these topics because students are in these real life practice situations. They have taken on the role of being a lawyer. So that's what I found has been really effective for me.
Great. Kathryn, I'm going to come back to you with the same question. What are some of the principles and methods you found to be effective in getting clinic and externship students, clinic students in your case, to be thinking about professional goals, professional identity formation?
One of the things that I really try and stress with my students is helping them really take ownership of the cases that they're working on and with the clients that they're working with, because in their minds, there's this huge gulf between law school and when they're in practice, when in reality, maybe it's a year, but for a lot more, it's, 6 months or so. And so I really try to encourage them to start thinking and acting as attorneys and lawyers. And so in doing that, I really focus on a lot of particularized lawyering skills. So in their MOUs that I have them do, while I ask them to think broadly of goals, I also ask them to just identify some of those really basic things, like being comfortable making a phone call. And I'm always shocked with the number of students who put that down as one of their goals. And then how excited and elated they are when they actually make their first phone call and the person is nice to them and, you know, doesn't hang up on them. But really focusing on particularized learning goals, such as emails, phone calls, letters to clients, those sorts of things, speaking in court. The other thing that I've done to sort of help students develop professional identity, and again, helping students understand what it means to be in community and practice and with other lawyers, is I encourage students to learn from each other. So that's having students working in teams, having the teams meet together to prepare for supervision before we actually have supervision. The other thing I did was sort of a twist on journals. And this was because I had students one semester saying how great the students the incoming semester were going to be. And I realized that there was some institutional knowledge that I was losing between semesters, between students. And so I have the students do, I call them progressive journals. And so students are assigned journals and prompts, and then those journals are handed down to the next group of students, so that the students can read through those and see, oh, I felt really weird about doing that too. Here's how someone else felt about it and how they resolved those issues. They're anonymous, so hopefully students feel open to talking about uncomfortable things in those. And I found those to be really helpful, because I think we have to remember, you know, it's not just the relationship between us and the students and us and the clients, but also the relationship between the students. And so to the extent that we can help develop that professional identity as a lawyer and community, that's one of the things that I work on.
Taking notes here. Amazing. At both the MOUs and progressive journals, you know, we're getting some comments. Alicia, can I turn to you?
Sure, and I'm going to be quick, because I think I'll some of what I do has already been shared by both Kelly and Kathryn. So I too have students do some goal setting at the beginning of the semester. I have them do a self-evaluation. Our mid-semester evaluation starts with a self-evaluation on their part. I use journals as well, or I stopped calling them journals and I call them reflective essays, just psychologically. So I too have students work in teams of two, and you know, again, to Kathryn's point, you know, it's a way to learn from each other, to support each other. I think rounds are also a way to learn from other people, from each other, both to help each other, but also learn from others. And and when I said that, you know, the changes in my syllabus, if you were to look at this semester's syllabus, and 10 years ago, the biggest change would be not only my learning outcomes, but also the last few years I've been doing a portfolio that the students, that there's 3 reflective questions, 3 reflective essays basically, but they also have to tie it to their work in the clinic. So they have to attach a piece of work, so that is tied to each of those questions. And so I think, you know, I try to be, I think, intentional in supervision as well, to think about, you know, that to sort of talk out loud about what being in the role of lawyer being versus in the role of law student or law clerk, or, you know, that, because I think for the most part, this is the first opportunity that our students have to be in the role of lawyer. They've done legal work before, but this is the first opportunity. And so I try to sort of name that and to be thinking about, and sometimes I say to the students that my goal is not to turn them into other Alicia lawyers, but to, to say, I want you to explore what being Danny lawyer means, or so that I try to name that so that they can be thinking about what does that mean for them to be in that role. And I think the creativity and the opportunity that we have in this profession, yeah, there are constraints, but there's also opportunity for creativity and to be our own selves in our work.
Wow, what a wonderful point that you just made explicit, Alicia, but I heard Kelly and Kathryn say, we're not looking to make lawyers like us, right? That's not, we're encouraging students in our clinical experiential teaching to forge their own identities, right? And that is such a crucial point that I think we're not always actively thinking about, but so important in all that we do. I'm going to dispense with a word cloud exercise we're going to do because I'm looking at the clock. So I'm going to go to question number 3. Kathryn, I'm going to start with you. We sort of tout, and I will admit I'm married to a non-clinical professor who wonders why we love, I mean, she loves my colleagues that she's met, but why do we all love being together so much, right? What we do. And I've talked to her over time about how clinical legal education is different than other parts of the law school curriculum. But for purposes of bringing new clinicians, new professors and teachers into our community, how do you see those differences? How are we different than other parts of the law school curriculum, experiential courses?
So, I don't like to generalize, but I will. And I'll use myself as the example, right? When I think back to law school, the places where I excelled were not in the traditional podium classes. Those were not classes that tapped on skills that were my strength. And so doing externships were where I was able to sort of get rid of the panic. Oh my gosh, I decided the wrong path. Should I be a lawyer? I haven't found anything that I'm connected to. And so often you'll get students who have that aha moment when they get to the clinics. It's like an audible sigh often that you'll get where they're like, oh, okay, now I know, now I get it, now I understand. And I think we have to give students some grace, because if we think back to what they've gotten, for us, it's in my clinic, it's 2 years. They usually come in their 3L year. They've been indoctrinated might be too harsh of a word, right? But they've been taught and to think and perform in a certain way. And that way isn't necessarily congruent with what we do in the clinics. If we're in the clinics or in the externships, we're encouraging students to try things out and fail and stumble and be okay with that and figure out how to get back up and move forward. And that's not what they've been taught otherwise. There really is sort of this difference between, I think being taught theory and sort of being taught how to show that that theory versus in clinics, we focus on theory, but we also focus on practice and those practice skills. And so I think it's really, I think that's the main difference, is that we're having students who are now coming to us in clinics being taught to think and perform in a certain way. And part of our work to do is to help students to a certain extent unlearn some of that and be comfortable with being able to use those skills and learn those skills that are really going to help them when they get out into practice.
Thank you, Kathryn. Alicia, what makes us different?
So I want to pick up for a moment on Kathryn's point about unlearning, because I think, not that I too hesitate a little bit, but I think that one of the things that students come into clinic thinking that there's an answer. And so I think, because, exams have an answer, or an answer that gets them an A and an answer that gets them a B, and, whatever. And so I think that that whole idea of getting comfortable with uncertainty, I think is one of the things that makes us different. And I think an important thing for students to start naming and being comfortable with. And so that I sometimes joke with students that if there were certainty, then there wouldn't be jobs for lawyers. And so to some extent that uncertainty in the law is what keeps us employed. And so I think that that in some ways is, but that is really disconcerting, I think, for most students. Especially, I think, those of us drawn to law, or many of us drawn to law. But I think another thing that makes us different is that our work isn't done when the semester is over. And so it isn't like, we grade the exam and turn in the grades and it's done. Right now I have students who did, fabulous work. But there's just, one of them did all this work on this operating agreement, and there's just some unknowns out there. Like, I realized when I saw that last draft, I'm like, I don't know how to do that. I got to talk to the accountant, because, what we write in that operating agreement really is an accounting question. And so, I'm going to have to do that. I'm the one who's going to have to deal with it, this summer. And so some of that, I think, and we all have different setups in the summer. And so, some of us cover our own cases in the summer, others of us don't. And so I think that that's another thing that makes us different, that our work isn't necessarily done at the end of the semester.
Well said. And this may be more for small group discussion, but depending on our setups within law school, where we're working, where we're teaching, there might not be, often there's not an understanding among our colleagues of that particular difference, right? Where everybody else might be transitioning into a summer that involves writing and nothing else, or not. It's something that is beneficial for everyone to know and understand, not always easy to convey and communicate. Kelly.
I would say that another thing that makes our work different is that we just get to know our students on a much deeper level. I've taught podium courses, and in those courses, we just focused on mostly law and policy. I didn't talk with students about their values and their priorities in life and who they wanted to be as a lawyer. That was a shortcoming on my part when I taught the podium courses. I should have done a better job of working those topics in. But those are the things that we explore so deeply in clinic and externship teaching. And so you really just get to know your students so much better, and you see their vulnerabilities. They have to be vulnerable with you, and you have to be somewhat vulnerable with them to engage in those kinds of conversations, and which are so rich. And I learn just as much from them, probably more from them than they learn from me. But I think it's so important that we're having those kinds of conversations and discussions, and really preparing them for the uncertainty that they're going to face in practice. And another thing that's different is, again, just that role assumption of the lawyer. I think clinics and externships, and probably slightly more clinics than externships, is really where they begin to feel the weight of being a lawyer and taking on a client's problem, as their own, and really feeling the responsibility and what that means. and, trying to manage that on top of, their other obligations, whether it's schoolwork or family obligations. And they can't hide in their clinic or externship work, like they can in a class of 150 people. We see them, we see the work they're doing, we see their struggles, and have to help them work through those. So there's just there's a level of intimacy, I think, in the teaching that is really a privilege of this kind of work that we do.
Is it fair to say, I don't know whether I asked this rhetorically or for the three of you to weigh in on, but there is, it seems to me, sort of purposeful self-centeredness that we promote the first year plus of a law school, right? Where we've got to get students getting, into a way of thinking about how they're learning the law, focusing more on the self, whether it's intentional or not. That I think that's what's promoted the transition to what we've thought of as client-centeredness, or just being centered on anything other than self, right, is something that I think experiential courses, and Kelly, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think in the externship setting, in my experience, that's a very real thing for our students too, right? They're out there doing that work for somebody else, yet within a school environment. And there's an artificiality that comes with being in a school and an academic setting, and yet the stakes are very real, right? Regardless of where we are. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Please disagree with me, or just reinforce, add to.
Well, I'll just weigh in and say, yeah, absolutely. The stakes are more real, and the stakes, there are consequences for someone beyond that student. So if they're not keeping up in their Civ Pro class, the consequence really just falls on them. They're going to get a bad grade in the class. But if they're not keeping up with their clinic or externship work, their client's going to suffer. And the reputation of the school may suffer because of the judges you're appearing before. And same thing in the externship context. I might lose that placement. I have lost placements when students didn't perform well. So the consequences of the work they're doing are just so much more far-reaching.
And I think one of the challenges, because I think we provide that transition from, being a student to practice, and whether student has had, a job before, it is being in this role of lawyer. And I think different students, I think that's to some extent sort of some of the interesting parts of this job, that, each student is an individual. And so we're watching each of them sort of either feeling freaked out by it, and how we support that, or not taking that seriously, or somewhere in between, right? And so that we then support that transition regardless of where the students are in that continuum. And that's part of what we have to do as the supervisors.
I think just one more thing to add to that. The two most common things, well, not common, but I think the scariest question for a student, the scariest thing for a student to say is, I don't know. And so encouraging students and making it a safe place for them to say, I don't know, so that they don't try and figure it out for the sake of trying to show that they know what they're doing, right? Because then that's when the errors happen. So being okay with saying, I don't know. And then if I had $1 for every time a student said, this is a stupid question. And I always tell students, the only stupid question is a question that goes unasked, right? But they're used to being in settings where, I remember in property, my 1L year, where I was stumbling on being on call and was essentially humiliated by the professor, right? And so there's no reason why I would speak up and ask a question in that class ever again, right? And so encouraging students to be comfortable with saying they don't know and asking the question that they think is a stupid question, because probably everyone else, maybe even including me, are also thinking the same thing. So I think keeping that in mind is important as well.
Okay, so we've made it to question number 4, at least the last question we planned to discuss, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for questions from the group. But what advice do you now, having been clinical educators for some time, working across the spectrum of clinical courses, what advice do you wish you would have received earlier? And what advice do you have to give to folks just starting out in clinical legal education? And Alicia, I think we're back to you to start.
Okay. So I think one of the points that I made earlier is one that I want to emphasize again, that, and to some extent, that your course is always a work in progress, and that's okay. And so, and I think but that means that you have to be forgiving of yourself as well, right? Don't expect that you're going to know everything in your early stages of the career. This is a lifelong process, just like lawyering is to some extent. And so I think it's okay to continue reflecting on what worked, what didn't work, and also know that I think each group and each individual is different. And so I sometimes say, oh, I just taught that class the exact same way I taught it last semester. And last semester was great. And this semester was like, ew. And so, so the ability to continue to reflect and to change and to improve, and to, I think, not even improve, but just to try something new, right? And so to see what works and whether something is, a better fit. So I think that would be one thing. And I think the other point I want to make is one point that's already been made, that I think the CLIA handbook for new clinical teachers is a great resource. And so I really would encourage you to take a look at it. It's got an introduction to all sorts of topics. I would call it the Cliff Notes version of a lot of topics. It has a list of listservs, including some of the substantive law listservs, and a bibliography of law review articles. And to make that point, that I made earlier, it's like, you can't read them all, right? And so it's like, just figure out, like, little by little, try to think about who you want to read and what areas you want to read. And it's got a list of textbooks, clinical textbooks. So for those of you, especially who are teaching alone, I also would highly recommend the book Transforming the Education of Lawyers by Sue Bryant, Elliot Milstein, and Ann Shalick. And I think it's a great resource. And for me, it always provides sort of a framework for what it is that we're doing. So I'll stop there.
Kelly.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on what Alicia was saying about, don't feel like you have to have read all of the literature in your first few years. When I first started teaching and I came right from practice and I looked at that, CLIA New Clinicians Handbook, and I saw that bibliography, my first thought was, oh my God, I know nothing. I haven't read all of this. And I think I can safely say probably by this point, I've read most of the externship literature, but it's taken me 15 years to do it. So, give yourself some patience in that regard. And then I would just encourage people, don't be shy about reaching out to people. Call, email, anybody in this community is so willing to help. The clinic listserv is a fantastic resource. If you're in the externship community, Lextern Web is the definitive source for all things externship. any resource you could ever want, I think is there. And then I'll recommend a book too. There's a great book by Michael Hunter Schwartz and Sophie Sparrow and Jerry Hess. It's called Teaching Law by Design, engaging students from the syllabus to the final exam. It's not specific to clinical teaching, but I think, that book combined with the Transforming the Education of Lawyers book, those are sort of two great bookends for clinical teachers.
Amazing resources, both. Kathryn.
I think echoing on what Kelly just shared, and this is something that I didn't do in the first part of my journey in clinical teaching, and I've done more intentionally in the past couple of years, is really getting involved in the national clinical community. Obviously your colleagues at whatever institution you are at are hopefully great resources for you within your clinical program and otherwise. But also there's such a wealth of information out there. And I've found some of my greatest professional growth has happened when I've connected with clinicians at institutions across the country and different opportunities. I've participated in a case rounds program where clinicians from, and that was through AALS, right? Where clinicians from around the country got together and we did case rounds. And I thought, how am I ever going to have time to do this and participate in it? But I made time for it, and I learned a lot. Being involved in CLIA, being last year's conference, there was a session on writing, and ended up forming a small group that we meet every Thursday now virtually to get together and hold each other accountable for writing. And that wouldn't have happened if my focus was just on my community and the people within my school. And I think everyone has said it here. You'll find that this group is more than willing to help. I'm always available, willing to talk and assist however I can. But just sort of get outside of your bubble, get outside of your silo, especially those of you that are maybe in smaller programs. It can be hard, challenging work. It is, I think, one of the greatest jobs, but it's not without challenges. So being around and surrounding yourself with people who think like you and who can encourage you and support you is just so important.
All wonderful guidance. I just want to reinforce a couple things. One is one difference I see in how most clinical faculty, clinical teachers work is we're a little more willing to put our vulnerabilities out there with our students, because that's what's necessary to be successful in practice. And I think being intentional about our messaging, about our pedagogy, about why we're doing what we're doing, that's not something I was used to with my professors in law school. I think we come from a history in legal education of a more hide the ball mentality, and those who are going to get it are going to get it. We have this beautiful opportunity to connect with our students in that way. And I think to teach them to be more thoughtful lawyers and advocates in doing it. It's one thought. Another thought is it's not a fresh thought, but it reinforces the point I'm going to make. This community shares everything. And it has been one of the greatest pleasures working with these three incredible clinicians to know that everything for me has been learning, even in prepping this session. I have told Kelly many times, I sent out a handbook to my externship course supervisors today that has rubrics I quite literally have taken from her scholarship. That's how we work. And I think within this community, there are always new ideas, always fresh ideas, even as long as we've been teaching. And it can be overwhelming, but there are so many people you can turn to for guidance and advice and just to run your ideas by. Please take advantage of that. It is something that really ultimately differentiates our community. It doesn't happen in other areas of the academy. I mean, it does in different ways, but I would put us up against anybody in that way. So I want to thank these incredible presenters and leave an opportunity for just a few minutes of questions. But to Alicia, to Kathryn, to Kelly, thank you. This has been a wonderful experience for me to learn from you over these last several weeks. And thank you for sharing your guidance and wisdom with all of our new clinicians attendees this morning. Okay, are there questions? Anybody have a question? While you're thinking of some questions, Professor Hill, I see you've raised your hand.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for just so many gems, a lot of notes, a lot of things I want to follow up on. My question is, are there any sort of guiding questions or things that you recommend starting professors reflect on to assess the year? I'm finishing up my first year as a clinical teaching fellow, and I'm just trying to think through, how do I assess what happened? And so I want to talk to my director probably in about a week, and I want to come in prepared. And I've done this process when I was at a nonprofit, when I was at a law firm, and just curious to know if you have any thoughts on how we should think about it in this context.
One of the things I would say, and welcome to the community, one of the things I would say is looking back at your learning goals and reflecting on those, looking back at the syllabus and giving some real thought about, did I achieve what I wanted when I was putting this reading here, this exercise here, or this learning goal here? I found that to be helpful in terms of gauging my progress in places that I can, improve or change or keep the same. So I would say looking back at your learning goals, they're not just for students, I think they're also for us as well.
Other thoughts, Alicia, Kelly?
Well, to build on Kathryn, because I think Kathryn, is right on. I think to think what were the things you wanted to work on? What were your goals? Or, did you have them starting out? And even looking back, what do you think they should have been? Because to some extent, it's thinking about what is it that you want to work on next year. And I think this goes back to the point that, several of us made. I think we have to have grace with ourselves that we just can't do it all. Just like, I think if anything this year has taught us is to have grace with our students, each other, ourselves. And so I think to be thinking that way, what is it that I'm gonna work on? And I'm going to say this, I didn't say this before, in sort of working with new clinical teachers in the past, I think a lot of them were more, were feeling a little bit more insecure about seminar and have found that it's supervision that's in some ways more challenging. And so I think that to be thinking about that way as well, what worked in supervision? What is it that you want to try to work on?
Professor Seeger, we have about 1 minute, and then I have a 1 minute announcement. So, or a 30-second announcement. Go ahead.
Sample syllabus, Sylvi?
I will tell you on the externship side, Lextern is a treasure trove, all kinds of documents. On the clinic side, in-house clinic, a lot of the text materials have sample syllabi, and I don't know, suggestions for that from any of our presenters?
I just go to someone who's teaching a similar course. And I think Danny was saying, we're all open to sharing. I haven't yet had someone say to me, no, I'm not going to share that with you. So just reaching out to someone who's teaching in a similar area and getting that.
Yeah, and Susan, if you're comfortable doing it, posting on the listservs, people will share, and you can ask for people to reply privately to you. You can also talk with one of us to, there are lots of different ways you can quickly gather sample materials. So
All right.
happy to talk offline about that.
Thank you.
I want to conclude with two things. One, I want to thank Nicole Miller, who has done so much to help with the planning of this conference and has been backup, really not backup, but on tech here. Thank you, Nicole. Nicole has created, along with Chris Ann Hazen and Lauren, our tech committee, a great resource. Nicole, can you just finish us out with a quick pointing of the finger to where people can go? I know you've posted it, but for now and throughout the week.
Yep. So I just put in the chat the link, and so some resources are already all there for you, but they'll be uploading additional materials throughout the week. So it's a great place, and we'll be saving all these chats as well, so that you can go back and make reference to the notes that everyone has shared. So thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Chris Ann. You'll see more Chris Ann tomorrow, and thanks to Lauren Bartlett too. Thanks again to our presenters. Thanks to all of you for making this opening session great. Have a wonderful week. We're going to reconvene as small groups in about 15 minutes, 12:45 Eastern, and have a wonderful, wonderful day and a wonderful week.